Hello, welcome to Evangelistic Apologetics. This is an introduction to systematic Christian worldview. We are on part 2 of the series, the theory of creation. And in this part, we are doing part C, which is called According to Science, the Counter-Arguments. We have given you the standard of truth. Overall, we're trying to present a theory of creation and judge whether or not it satisfies the standard of truth. So it's possibly a candidate for the truth. And then we're going to compare it with evolution later. And in presenting the theory of creation, we gave you 2 ways to see it from the Bible. One is the literal way, and one is the somewhat stretched way. And the non-literal way is for the purpose of making the Bible fit what science says, assuming that science says something that's incontrovertible, and therefore believing that truth must be one, you have to move something to fit the other. And if you don't know how to move science, you move the Bible. However, does the science really say something incontrovertible against the Bible, especially Genesis? And that's what we are on. Okay, according to science, the counter-arguments, or potential, the so-called counter-arguments. Okay, and we have found out the major objection of science to Genesis is not really based on incontrovertible facts or logic. It's based on assumptions. And the 3 major assumptions are called the secular timescales. One is called the astronomical timescales, which expands the creation week in Genesis into billions of years. Let's say roughly 15 billion years, the age of the universe. And another is called the geological timescale, which stretches the year of flood into billions of years, and basically the age of the earth, roughly about 4.5 billion years. Okay, and we have given you proofs that the astronomical evidence timescale was not necessary, because it assumes certain things, such as that the universe has no center, and every point is leaving every point just like every other point. And that is an assumption. It's called a cosmological principle, and that's assumed because of atheism. So using theology to determine science is not a good way, right? So if we take the simplest theory, then recognizing that the current data points to that the galaxy, the Milky Way galaxy, seems to be the center of the universe, and everything fits. And then there is a good explanation of the disparity between the size of the universe and the shortness of the time. Okay, so that is done. The first time scale was explained away. That assumption, okay, is now found to be based on assumptions. Okay, so it's not necessary. Today we're going to do another, it's called the geological time scale. And there are several objections to Genesis based on this. And some of them are pretty simple. For example, people have seen the maps. If you take the map of the world, you see that the continents seems to fit, on the 2 sides of Atlantic Ocean. And right now we know that the continents are platonic crusts. They are plates, and these plates are moving. And we know that right now the African and actually the India, the subcontinent of India, it is moving against the major plate of Eurasia and is pushing up the Himalaya mountains. And we know how fast the mountains rise these days. It's just a few centimeters every year. Okay, so if assume the speed is uniform, then you can calculate stretch back. Okay, assume that speed and assume that the Americas are separated from Eurasia and Africa, and go back, you take millions of years. But do you see there's an assumption in there? There's an assumption that the speed is uniform, right? But why not the speed, being non-uniform? It's very possible that it was fast for a while, and now once these continents collide, and so it's small. But for a while, it might be quick. And according to the Bible, in Genesis, God separated the land, singular, the land, the dry land, from the waters. So originally, the continent was one. And it was split, probably beginning from the time of the Great Flood. And it started to split. And there is a visible split during the life of Peleg, because his name means split, separate, division. And the Bible says, in the life of Peleg, the earth was divided. And it probably means both the continents separating and the people were separated because of the Tower of Babel. So anyway, it's from the Great Flood to the end of the life of Peleg that the continents were separated and it formed today's shape. And in the beginning, it must be pretty fast. And later, it slowed down. You see, there is nothing logically contradicting the earth. The facts today, it just means the situation today. And the fact that it points back together, it affirms the Bible. And the speed is simply an assumption. So that is an easy way. Okay, so we say it's the plate tectonic. We say this is the issue of plate tectonics. Okay, or we call it the continental drift theory. Okay, now this issue is based on assumption is on the uniform speed. Okay, if you don't assume that, then there's nothing contradicting the Bible. Okay, so that is pretty easy to deal with. And let's say another thing. How about the carbon-14 dating? Now, a lot of people assume that carbon-14 dating can determine the Earth to be really old, and therefore contradicting the Bible. But that statement is based on a lot of actually ignorance, because we know that, first of all, what's the limit of carbon-14 dating? The limit, it's about 10,000 years. Why? Because its half-life, the half-life of carbon-14 is about 5,000 years. And even that, the date, you can still doubt that, because how long can you measure the decay of something? When I was in college, I measured the half-life of a radioactive an isotope, and it decays exponentially, and the number decays exponentially. This is time, this is the number, and when it decays to its half, this is called T half. This is called half-life. It measures how fast it decays. Okay, the one I measured has a half-life about an hour, and I have to measure about, let's say, a half an hour to say I have a regular shape, because it's all dots, around there. To form a shape, you got to have enough data, and you got to measure long enough. If you measure very short time, it's hard to say, what the shape will like later, right? So for something that has 5,000 years half-life, and you only measure science, how old is science? 500 years, let's say, a tenth of it, how can you be sure of the shape of the curve? Even that is doubtable. But let's assume that's correctly. And the limit you can measure, it's just about double the half-life. And more than that, the data will become so small and the shape can be manipulated to be any sign, any direction it can. So first of all, this cannot measure the age of the Earth. This is for measuring things that's short. It's about 10,000 years. Okay, and second of all, anything that is measured within last 4,000 years, it generally agrees with the Bible. Okay, so within that range, there's no contradiction. And second of all, there is an assumption of the mechanism. Okay, how did carbon-14 generate? Well, we know that on the Earth, you have this is the Earth, okay, and you have the cosmic rays. The cosmic rays generates with the air, and then it makes the nitrogen and into carbon-14. Okay, and the carbon-14 will change into carbon-12, and it has the half-life, okay, of about 5,000 years. Okay, assume that's correct. So the reason that there are carbon-14 is because there are cosmic rays in the atmosphere. Okay. And well, assuming that we know the ratio of carbon-14 over carbon-12, okay, you call it the carbon-14 the mother and the carbon-14 the daughter, okay. So assuming the mother-daughter ratio today is the same with before, okay, then you can measure a time. Okay, so what happens is that when the air has the carbon-14 and you have the leaves, let's say, that breathe, okay, they breathe. You have the carbon-14 that from the air that gets into it, and when this organic material, usually a plant, dies, and the amount of carbon-14 over carbon-12, it will start to decay, right? Because it's not breathing anymore. Okay. So today, when you have a piece of wood, and you can measure the mother-daughter, ratio, okay, and you found out it is lower than today's ratio in today's air, okay, and then by assumption that today's the mother-daughter ratio today equals the mother-daughter ratio of before, when this thing was alive. Okay, only if you assume that today's ratio in the air is the same as it was before. And then once you measure the ratio in this wood and how much it is lower than it is today. So let's say you find out it's at this place, it's pretty low, and you assume that when it was alive, it was there. And so knowing the half-life, you can calculate how long it took. Okay, but that's based on the assumption that when that thing was living, the ratio in the air, the mother-daughter element ratio in the air, was equal to what you know today. However, that assumption is loaded with problems. And first of all, if you measure the carbon-14, carbon-12 ratio today, you find out actually it is increasing. It's not stable. Okay, and so today's it's increasing and it's not saturated. It's not stable, and also this is assuming that when this thing was living, okay, and the cosmic ray can enter the air, the atmosphere, as it is today. But the problem is, if you really read the Bible literally, you know that in the second day of creation, God created a water above. Okay, the water will prevent the neutrons in the cosmic ray to enter the atmosphere. Okay, so that means before the flood, there was basically no carbon-14 in the air. And after the flood, it starts to be created and is increasing. And today, it's almost saturated, still not saturated. And some people calculated it takes about 20,000 years or so to be saturated. And today, it's only 4,000 years. So it's not saturated yet. So this assumption is loaded with a problem. It assumes that it's stable. Now, it is not stable. It is assumed that before cosmic ray can enter the atmosphere, well, maybe it's not. If the Bible is true, there is a water above. So anyway, we can see that the carbon-14 dating is based on a bunch of assumptions. Okay, so it is not a solid proof of age anyway, and it's only usable for within 10,000 years, and even with that, it needs to be adjusted with this beginning date. So a lot of the dates are slightly longer than they actually be, but actually things actually are. But with the adjustments, everything would meet with the Bible. So you see, the carbon-14 dating did not contradict with the Bible. And how do we know that it's more likely that the cosmic rays did not enter the atmosphere before the flood? Well, before the flood, the Bible recorded people's age to be really long, right? They are 900 something years. The ideal age was 1,000. And after it drops to the ideal age of 120. And we barely reach that. The loss of the water above, or the water canopy, was a very reasonable explanation of this drastic change. All right, so this is one problem that is solved. And how about, let's see the issue of the radioactive isotope dating. Radioactive isotope dating. Now, this is the way that determines the Earth was about 4.5 billion years old. But how do they do that? Well, they have, we know there are that uranium that can decay into lead. And we know that potassium can decay into argon. Basically, we just say this is mother, daughter and mother-daughter thing. And the half-life was about, let's say, a billion years, Now, this, again, you can doubt the date, the half-life, because the measurement is barely a scratch of the assumed time. But let's assume that is correct. Then how do you get the age of the Earth? Well, you have to measure the rocks. First of all, you have to, given a rock, okay, you have to assume that initially that the mother-daughter, well, actually it should be daughter over mother. Sorry, I didn't write that correctly. The daughter over mother, yeah, that was 0. There's no daughter element. This is all the mother element. Okay, you have to assume this rock in the beginning it has all uranium and no lead, all potassium and no argon. Okay, however, you found different results by the measurement of the rocks from all around the Earth. They don't give you the same date, and they differ quite a lot. So how can you do that? Well, you have to assume that the rate is different. Well, if you assume the rate is different, then why not assume it's nearly today's ratio? Then any date is possible, right? Once you go to non-zero, any date is possible. Okay, and how did they get it today? Well, they have assumed that the the Earth is around the sun. You have the Mercury. You have what's the second one? There's Venus, and then the third one is the Earth, and then the fourth one is the Mars, and then from Mars to Jupiter, okay, has a long distance, and in the middle there are a lot of dwarf planets, and so these little dwarf planets thing, some of them came to the Earth and became meteors. Okay, and people found out that there is one meteor. We found out one meteor. Okay, one meteor, and you assume that was formerly a dwarf planet. And therefore it's about the same age as the Earth. Okay, and that is an assumption. Okay, same age as the Earth. That came from the stardust assumption of Immanuel Kant, assuming that the solar system is condensation from a stardust and the cloud condensed into the sun and the many planets, and that itself it's an assumption. Okay, so it came from the stardust cloud theory. Okay, that gave you the same age assumption. Okay, and you measure from that one meteor and assume that age is the Earth, and that's how you get the Earth as 4.5 billion years. Okay, it's not really from measuring the Earth because you get very different results. Okay, it's from measuring that one meteor and assume that's equal to the Earth. But on the Earth is different, everywhere else. You can see that there are so many assumptions, okay? And if you allow the initial daughter element to be non-zero, then it can be assumed to be any number. And maybe just very close to today's number. Okay, so that is not really a problem, the radioactive isotope dating. And how about what we call the geological years. How do you get that? Well, that is you have to assume that all of these layers are sedative rocks from different times over millions of years. But when you do that, you cannot explain some vertical trees. All right, in which millions of years did it come in there? And we know that there are these evidences never been presented in the standard textbooks these days because it contradicts their theory. Okay? This can be easily explained by the flood. Okay? All of these rocks are all from the 1 year great flood. So that explains this better than the others. Okay? And when you assume that it has many, many layers, well, you have to assume that the lowest is the oldest and the top is the youngest. Okay? And if you assume that, then that goes to another problem. It's what we call the index fossil. Index fossil is that you have certain fossils in certain layers. Okay, there are the simpler are in the lower and the complex are in higher because of evolution, right? Because time, if you assume the time is the oldest is below, and then the simplest life form must be in the bottom. But in the bottom layer, it's called Cambrian. We have found Cambrian age. We have found all complex forms of the non-vertebrate. Okay. Non-vertebrate animals, all the complex forms. So you have to assume this, that all of the life forms appeared suddenly in the Cambrian age. Okay, and later there are very few changes. You see, that is contradicting to the evolution theory. And of course, and also the age of the fossils cannot be dated. Only the rocks can be dated. Okay, and but from the rocks to fossils, but the rocks, since you don't know the initial and initial daughter-mother element ratio, and you have give the rocks the date by assuming the fossils have an age. Okay, that the fossils, according to the theory of evolution, you assign them an age and you give it to the fossil. To the rocks, and then you use the rocks to date the fossil. Don't you have a circular reasoning problem? Yeah, it's in the loops, you see. Now, all of these things are somewhat related with the geological time scale, but we can pretty clearly see that this geological time scale is based on a load of assumptions, and all its purpose, all its effect is to extend the 1 year long great flood into billions of years. But that's not necessary. So why not just stick to the literal meaning of the Bible? Thank you.